I love cinema. Now I can already imagine you guys roll your eyes and sarcastically comment, "Oh wow, I guess you like puppies and pizza too." And well, I do, but that's irrelevant. When I say I love cinema, I truly mean it. Everything about it fascinates me. I mean, it's one of the only medium that combines all art forms to create something as magnificent and powerful as this. The Fall of the Balrog in Lord of the Rings, which is for me the greatest movie shot in cinema history. And while today the industry is largely dominated by Hollywood or even Bollywood, I believe no country has pioneered cinema more than France. And in this new series, I hope to make you discover some of those pioneers. Alors, lumière. Marie-Georges Jean Méliès was born on December 8th, 1861, from a family of wealthy bootmakers. He started his education at the Lycée Michelet until it was bombed during the Franco-Prussian War. You know, typical stuff. After that, he went to the prestigious Lycée Louis le Grand, a fact that he often brought up whenever filmmakers were accused of being illiterate, incapable of producing anything artistic. Much like Uwe Boll. Although Méliès was the first one to admit that his artistic interests far outweighed his intellectual ones, as he was often disciplined for covering his textbooks with doodles. After he graduated, Méliès seemed destined to pursue the family business of shoemaking until his father sent him to London to work as a clerk. There he often visited the Egyptian Hall, where he developed a lifelong passion for magic. When he returned to France, he hoped to study painting at the École des Beaux-Arts, but his father refused to support him as an artist, so he kept working at the shoe factory. Nevertheless, he harbored his love for magic by regularly attending performances at the Théâtre Robert Houdin in Paris, as well as taking magic lessons. Eventually, he became talented enough to perform at the renowned Cabinet Fantastique of the Grévin Wax Museum. Finally, in 1888, when his father retired, he sold his share of the shoe business to his brothers and used the money to buy the Théâtre Robert Houdin, which had been suffering from low attendance. He then spent the next 9 years renovating it by introducing 30 new illusions that he had invented. His most famous one was perhaps the recalcitrant decapitated man, which featured a man who didn't allow a simple decapitation get in the way of telling his story. It is also during that time that Méliès met performer Jeanne d'Alcy, who quickly became his mistress and muse. Thanks to his efforts, the theater's attendance drastically improved, and Méliès was now able to hire the greatest illusionists of his time. But his success meant that he was now relegated to the backstage to direct, produce, write, design sets and costumes, as well as invent many of his performers' tricks. And while he surely missed the spotlight, this was crucial in allowing him to build the necessary skills to later become a successful director. On December 28, 1895, Méliès attended a private demonstration of the Lumière Brothers cinematographe, an early version of the modern camera and projector. Méliès immediately offered them 10,000 francs for the camera, but they refused, as they foolishly believed there was no future in cinema and wanted to keep it as a purely scientific tool. Not discouraged, Méliès traveled to London to purchase an animatograph, which he soon reversed engineered into a working camera, thus allowing him to project his own movies in his theater by May 1896. In autumn of that same year, an event occurred that would change the face of cinema. While filming a bus, Méliès' camera jammed, which took him a few minutes to repair. By the time the camera started working again, the bus was replaced by a hearse. He didn't think much of the accident until he developed the film and realized how the magic of cinema allowed one to make objects disappear and transform. He understood that cinema had the capacity to distort time and space to create illusions. In short, he had discovered special effects. Now, to be fair, Edison had already used that effect in the execution of Mary Stuart, but it would be in Méliès's hands that special effects reached their true artistic purpose. For example, he invented the first double exposure, going as far as using 7 multiple exposures at once for the one-man band. He invented the first split screen, which he did by blocking one side of the camera lens, filming, and then reusing the same strip of film while blocking the other side of the camera lens. And he also invented the first dissolve, or even the first graphic manipulations. Throughout his career, Méliès kept using his ingenuity and creativity to build intricate scenes that brought the illusions he performed on stage to a whole new level. At the end of 1896, Méliès founded the Star Film Company, one of the first film studios in history. He built a studio in his Montreuil property in the outskirts of Paris. It was made entirely of glass as to allow enough light for the camera and enable Méliès to produce 78 movies in his first year alone. And as he did for his feature, he worked tirelessly in every aspect of the production, whether it was set design, writing, camera work, coming up with new special effects, acting, and so much more. At first, his movies included a wide range of styles, from documentaries to on-camera magic tricks to even pornographic material. But by 1898, after more than 130 movies, it was clear to Méliès that his true calling was the fantastical. By then, his rate of production had drastically lowered to only 27 movies per year. But each movie was more complex and intricate than the last. This allowed him to direct some of his greatest pieces, such as the first horror movie in history, Robbing Cleopatra's Tomb, which depicted Cleopatra as a mummy. It's also during that time he directed the first of his many satirical religious films, which showed the statue of Jesus Christ on the cross turning into a seductive mistress, Jeanne d'Alcy. In 1899, he made 2 of his most ambitious movies. The very controversial Affaire Dreyfus, which discussed the case of Jewish officer Alfred Dreyfus, who had been falsely framed and accused of treason by his superiors. The case was extremely problematic in France as it brought to the spotlight the rampant anti-Semitism that reigned in Europe much before the Nazis. Méliès was pro-Dreyfus and showed him in a sympathetic light, which resulted in numerous physical fights during the film's screenings until the police censored it. Later that year, more than half a century before Walt Disney, Méliès made the first movie adaptation of Cinderella, a 6-minute-long movie featuring 35 actors and, above all, multiple tableaux, better known as scenes, which contrasted with the fixed backgrounds that had been used until then. This movie was Méliès's call to fame, as it became wildly popular in both Europe and the United States. However, Thomas Edison, being Thomas Edison, resented Méliès's success as it impeded on the monopoly he had held on film production until then. He attempted to have Méliès's movies forbidden from being screened in the US, but Méliès retaliated by creating a syndicate which would protect the foreign interests of French movie makers. And so it was through this growing international popularity that he continued creating greater and greater pieces of art. He became especially interested in using perspective in order to make characters and objects change in size, an effect that would be used more than a century later by Peter Jackson in The Lord of the Rings. This is best shown in his movie The Man with the Rubber Head, which required an intricate trolley system that Méliès, of course, designed and built himself. This, along with all the other illusions he had perfected throughout the years, would be used in his masterpiece. And now I can hear a general "ah" from the crowd as you recognize this timeless scene from A Trip to the Moon, Méliès's instant 1902 classic, loosely based on From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne, yet another French visionary. The movie is widely considered the first science fiction film ever, and is simply spectacular. While it is not his most technical piece, It embodies everything that made him so great. The beautiful set designs, the intricate costumes, the elaborate effects, the story which doesn't take itself too seriously, the sense of wonder and adventure as one would have back then whenever they looked at the moon without ever knowing what lay there. This feeling of the captured dream that is present in so many of Méliès' movies is just so charming, and I strongly suggest everyone watches it. He even went as far as having each frame painstakingly painted in order to make it the first colored movie, which you can watch through the link in the description. At 14 minutes long and costing 10,000 francs to produce, the movie was a smashing success, especially in the US. But unfortunately, Méliès didn't get to enjoy most of his international success, as film producers such as Sigmund Lubin and Thomas Edison made a fortune by selling illegal copies of his movies. Their disregard for his copyright was so blatant that they started collecting royalties from other companies for using the movies they had stolen from Méliès. It was outrageous. As a result, Méliès partnered with his brother Gaston, whose shoe business had been failing, in order to open a studio in New York with the promise of aggressively fighting counterfeiters. Nevertheless, Méliès didn't allow this to stop his artistic ambitions, as he directed in the following year The Kingdom of the Fairies, which critics have called undoubtedly his best film, and in any case, the most intensely poetic. And from this, he rode on a wave of constant success and increasingly ambitious movies. In 1904, he made a sequel to his famous A Trip to the Moon, called The Impossible Voyage, which, at 24 minutes long, was considered yet another success. He also kept expanding his Montreuil studio by adding electricity, buying new costumes, and building a whole new set. But just a year later, his popularity started to waver. His fairy style that he was known for was growing less and less popular. And so Méliès was forced to try new genres, such as crime films. Nevertheless, that didn't stop declining sales, and he was forced to cut the prices of all his movies by 20%. By 1907, critics had started to note that his movies awkwardly balanced between a repetition of old formulas on one hand and an uneasy imitation of new trends on the other. In 1908, his film studio, Star Film Company, was pressured into joining Thomas Edison's Motion Picture Patents Company, under threat of being sued for patent infringement otherwise, as Edison held most patents related to cinematography. Under the terms of his contract, Méliès was forced to supply the conglomerate 1,000 feet of film per week. Obviously, such a rush for production meant that the quality of his movies significantly deteriorated. Nevertheless, he was still able to direct some masterpieces. For example, he made Humanity Through the Ages, a pessimistic tale of the history of mankind. But while he was extremely proud of this movie and remained proud of it throughout his lifetime, it was a flagrant commercial failure. 2 years later, Méliès made a deal with famous film distributor Charles Pathé. In exchange of a large sum of money to produce and direct movies, Pathé held the rights to distribute and edit them. He also held the rights to Méliès' home and Montreuil studio. This deal would come to destroy Méliès' career. In 1911, he produced 2 extremely ambitious fairy movies. And while these would have been wildly popular just a decade prior, they were now expensive failures. The following year, he produced his longest movie ever, with a 44 minutes long The Conquest of the Pole, based on the recent expeditions to the pole by Robert Peary and Roald Amundsen. Again, the movie was a financial flop. One of his last fairies was made in 1912 and was a retelling of his immensely popular Cinderella movie. The movie was 1 hour long, which was incredible considering the fact that cinema didn't even exist less than 2 decades prior. But Pathé massively edited down to just over 30 minutes, and it was still a flop. After a couple more similar flops, Méliès decided to break his contract with Pathé later that year. Meanwhile, his brother Gaston in the US was no better off, as he had decided to travel through Asia to film documentaries. However, the films were often damaged while they were sent back to his studio in New York. Unable to fulfill his obligations to Thomas Edison and having lost $50,000 or almost $1.3 million today, he was forced to sell his film studio in 1913. He returned to Europe and died only 2 years later, having never spoken to his brother again. Méliès was now severely indebted to Pathé. And while the advent of World War I meant that Pathé was unable to take possession of his studio, it didn't change much, as Méliès was too bankrupt to produce anything. Not that he wanted to, as the horrors of the war and the divide that had built between his brothers and him were finally able to break his seemingly unwavering desire to make movies. The final straw occurred in 1913 when his wife, Eugénie, died, which left him alone with a 12-year-old child, André, to raise. His theater was shut down by the war, and the French army had turned his Montreuil studio into a military hospital, as well as confiscated 400 of his films to melt down into shoe heels for the army. In 1923, the Théâtre Robert Houdin was torn down to build the Boulevard Haussmann, and that same year, Pathé was able to take over Star Films and the Montreuil studio. In a fit of rage, Méliès decided to burn his costumes, sets, and above all, his movies, which as a result were long thought to have been lost to the world. But fortunately, through extensive search, over 200 of his movies have been rediscovered, although that pales in comparison to the 500 movies he directed throughout his career. And we must come to accept that many of those have truly been eternally lost. In 1925, Méliès married his longtime mistress, Jeanne d'Alcy, but by then he was mostly forgotten and financially ruined, as the couple barely scraped by operating a small candy and toy stand in the Gare Montparnasse in Paris. But fortunately, Méliès had started to be rediscovered again, as the year prior, the journalist Georges Michel Kozak interviewed him for a book on the history of cinema. In it, Kozak hoped to underline the importance of French pioneers in the early days of cinema. In 1926, following the success of Kozak's book, the magazine Ciné Journal asked to publish his memoir, which further bolstered Méliès's newfound, or rather refound, prestige. Throughout the end of the 1920s, more and more journalists took interest in him, and eventually a gala of appreciation was made on December 1929, which Méliès described as one of the most brilliant moments of his life. Finally, in October 1931, he was made a Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur, the highest honor in France. The medal was presented to him by no other than Louis Lumière, who called Méliès the creator of the cinematic spectacle. Perhaps an admission that he was wrong to not sell him their camera more than 30 years ago. An admission that while his brother and him had invented the camera, Méliès had invented cinema. But his newfound fame did little to alleviate his poverty, and in a letter to a friend, he admitted, "Luckily enough, I am strong and in good health, but it is hard to work 14 hours a day without getting my Sundays or holidays, in an ice box in winter and a furnace in summer." Méliès died in poverty of cancer on May 21st, 1938, at age 76. Some of his last words advised his friends, "Laugh, my friends, laugh with me, laugh for me, because I dream your dreams." And today his name is but a bookmark in history, even for cinephiles. The greatest recognition he has received in recent years was perhaps Scorsese's Hugo, an alright movie that featured Méliès as one of its secondary characters, which was a shame because the scenes recounting his life were by far the best of the movie. Although one must appreciate how much Ben Kingsley and Méliès look alike. And recently, a Kickstarter was started in order to repair his crumbling grave. And while the Kickstarter was successful, it's a tragedy for me that his grave was even allowed to deteriorate this much in the first place. Because what truly makes his movies so great is Georges Méliès himself. Sure, today, his movies are not the most thrilling to watch, especially since many screenings of silent movies feature generic music and not the tailored orchestral pieces that were an integral part of movies back then. But watching a Méliès movies is like watching a dream, watching an extract of pure imagination. You get a sense of frontier as Méliès used creativity and ingenuity to not only overcome the technical limitations he faced back then, but from that create a unique art style. You can only smile at the beauty and uniqueness of his movie sets, costumes, characters, and more. You can only appreciate the genius he showed and his ability to tell the stories he wanted to tell. When you watch a Georges Méliès movie, you can't help but feel emotional as you sense the love, energy, and passion he put into each of his movies. Much like a child that received a new toy and can't wait to discover all the great worlds they will build with it. You feel the endless efforts and determination he put into making his dreams come true. And efforts is really an understatement here, as he worked every day from 7 a.m. for 10 hours on his movies, which he then followed by evening shows at his theater until midnight, every single day of the week. And as someone who is truly passionate of cinema, I can only sit and watch in awe something beautiful, something wonderful, a fantastical world, his fantastical world. And so next time someone asks you, who is your favorite movie director? I hope you consider Georges Méliès.
Hello everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider leaving a like, sharing, commenting, and if you haven't yet, subscribing. This was Baris, I will see you next week, but until then, merde!